Welcome to History Tea, the channel where I spill the tea on history. Today's video is about Victorian mourning etiquette, the standards that Victorians were held to when it came to grieving publicly. First of all, I just want to say that this video is going to be a little bit different than usual, mostly just because it's a little last minute. Luckily, I already knew a fair amount about this topic. I'm also clearly not wearing something from this century. It's a reproduction, so technically it is from this century, but it's an 1860s mourning dress and bonnet. Probably around 1863, since the silhouette of this dress didn't really come into play till 1863. And yeah, I was gonna try to find a place to film where you could see the whole thing, but honestly, there's nowhere to film in my house where you can see the whole thing. So I'm gonna put pictures in right now. If you don't know, mourning is the period of time where you grieve the loss of a loved one. Now, the life expectancy for Victorians was up compared to the life expectancy of previous centuries, especially for those who aged past the age of 5. But death was still very much around for them. They were very familiar with death. Mourning etiquette existed prior to Prince Albert's death in 1861, but wasn't as rigid. Queen Victoria went into mourning that year and never really came out until her own death in 1901. Now, at the time, anything the Queen did was popularized and replicated by the public, kind of like with the Kardashians today. So when she went into such a deep and strict and never-ending mourning, the public kind of followed suit, and from then on into the Edwardian era, mourning etiquette was very strict. Now, I say strict, but there weren't any mourning etiquette laws, so you couldn't be arrested for not following mourning etiquette, but they were upheld by societal standards, as were most things back then and even today. The number one way people would show that they were in mourning was with the clothes that they would wear. This depended on what stage of mourning you were in. The first stage being full mourning or deep mourning. In this stage, people would usually wear all black. But it also depended on gender. So like women would wear all black, but men didn't necessarily have to wear a black suit. They could just wear a dark suit, and they would always have the white shirt underneath. The next stage was called half mourning, and this was when color started to come back in, usually going from black to gray first, and then working in some mauve and other shades of purple. Mourning also affected a woman's accessories. So her bag, fan, parasol, handkerchief, jewelry. Typically, jewelry wasn't worn during deep mourning, but when it was worn, it was usually made out of jet. Jet was very popular in the Victorian era and was used outside of mourning clothes and accessories as well. A man in mourning would wear, like I said, his typical dark suit with a black cravat, black necktie, and black hatband. Black buttons and cufflinks were also worn, and some men would also wear a black armband, but that was more reserved for men who had to wear a specific uniform, like servants who had a death in their household or military men. While the Victorians were very aware of death, they were also very aware of life. And for this reason, young children were not expected to enter deep mourning, either because they were seen as too young to understand their loss, or adults didn't want to spoil their youthful fun. Typically, children would wear white instead of black, I think to symbolize purity. So again, like I said, the Victorians were very aware of life as well. So mourning was less strict for young people, in particular children, because they wanted them to live their lives while they still could. The length of the mourning period depended on your relation to the departed and your gender. Like with most things in history, women got the short end of the stick. And are we surprised by this? Nope. When a woman would lose her husband, she would enter mourning for at least 2 years. The first year would be deep mourning, where she would wear a black dress and a black crepe bonnet like this one, and a black veil would be worn over the face for at least 3 months, like this. But after that time, she could move the veil to the back like this. The veil must be worn throughout the first year though. It is pinned, at least on this one it's pinned, so it is removable. I'm going to be posting close-up pictures so you can see all the details of the bonnet on my social medias, which will be linked below, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. It's a really pretty bonnet. It actually has like velvet details, and it's really pretty. And then they would go into half mourning in the second year, which is when color would start to gradually come back, like I said earlier. Now, a lot of women would actually follow the example of Queen Victoria and would likely enter mourning and never come out for the rest of their lives. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Now, like I said earlier, women got the short end of the stick when it came to mourning. While a woman had to mourn her husband for 2 years, a man only had to mourn his wife for 1, because, you know, the loss of a husband is just more devastating than the loss of a wife. Everyone knows that. But at the end of the day, it wasn't super fun for either party, because both widows and widowers had to enter a seclusion period during their deep mourning period. This meant no paying or receiving visits and no fun activities like going to the theater. You may be wondering about getting married while in your mourning period. Well, if you were remarrying after the death of a spouse, it was really only socially acceptable for men to do so, and they usually waited a few weeks out of respect for their dead wife, and they needed time to find a new wife. Now, get this. If a man remarried within his mourning period, the new wife would have to wear black and assume mourning over the previous wife as well, whether she knew her or not. How fun. Now, a woman remarrying would have to wait 2.5 years, so her mourning period and then some, which is ridiculous. But there were certain circumstances that allowed women to remarry after the first 6 months. And this was for women who had a husband that was abroad for a while and then turned up missing or dead, or their husband was sick for a long time before dying and they had children to feed. So it was probably more typical with working class women who kind of needed a man in the household to provide, and because that was unfortunately the way things were at this time. And I think middle and upper class women would be able to financially rely on family members or money left by their dead husbands. Now, if you were getting married in your mourning period, whether you were mourning a spouse, or you were marrying someone mourning a spouse, or you were mourning someone else, black wedding dresses, mourning wedding dresses, were a thing. Now, it's not that weird considering that the white wedding dress tradition kind of started with Queen Victoria and it still wasn't very popular at this time. So a black wedding dress wasn't that weird, especially with all the mourning etiquette going on at this time. The length of the mourning period for non-stossel family members was shorter and equal lengths for men and women. Woo! For a child mourning the loss of a parent, or the parent mourning the loss of a child, it was a year or a year and a half. Now, for a child under the age of 10, it was most likely 6 months, and for an infant, 6 weeks. For a sibling, it was around 6 to 8 months. For aunts and uncles and cousins and stuff like that, it was 3 to 6 months, and for a friend, generally 3 weeks. Now, it's important to remember that the mourning period could last longer if the person wanted it to, because mourning was more of a outward reflection of how people felt on the inside. I'm just going to throw some additional mourning etiquette at y'all real quick. Reusing mourning clothes was not typically done because it was seen as bad luck to keep black crepe in the house after the mourning period was concluded. Therefore, it was discarded. I believe that even if someone else died right away, that they would still go out and purchase new mourning clothes. Because of this, mourning warehouses started to pop up and became a very lucrative business, as they always had mourning clothes readily available. Now, if for financial reasons someone could not afford to keep buying mourning clothes all the time, or they didn't have time to go out right away and buy mourning clothes as soon as someone died, then they would take their normal clothes and dye them a darker hue or black. If you're a stationery freak like me and you like pretty neat things, then this one is for you. Mourning stationery. It was a thing. It existed. Any letters that you sent out while you were in your mourning period would be on white paper with a black border, and the size of the border was more of a personal preference thing. Although if it was a business letter, it would be sent out on plain white paper like usual. When there was a death in a household, black crepe would be placed on the doorknob, typically in the time between the actual death and the burial. When someone died in their home, which was very typical in this era, All the clocks would be stopped at their time of death, all the curtains would be drawn, and all of the mirrors would be covered, out of the fear that their soul could become trapped in one of the mirrors. The Victorian funeral is very different from the modern funeral, especially lately as they become more of a celebration of life than they are a reflection of death. Now, to start, they had funeral processions, and a big, extravagant, upper-class funeral procession was really a sight to be seen and something that everyone strived for. They had black gloves and black hat bands and big black ostrich plumes, and sometimes horses would even be dyed black, which I don't agree with, but whatever. And if it was a child, it would all be white to symbolize purity. So white gloves, white hat bands, white ostrich plumes, white coffin, white trimmings on all the carriages and everything. It was really beautiful, and I wish I could see one. But because that was seen as the best way to send off your loved one, people, even if the ones left alive would financially struggle after the funeral, they would give their loved one the best possible, most extravagant funeral that they possibly could. About 6 to 8 pallbearers would be chosen to assist in the funeral, typically near in age to the deceased. They would be sent invitations requesting their help, and they would wear black gloves and black crape around their arm provided by the family of the deceased. And again, it would be white if it was for a child. They would carry the coffin from the house to the hearse and from the hearse to the grave. Now, funeral invitations were like mourning stationery, white with a black border, and people attending the funeral were asked to wear black even if they weren't going to assume mourning over the deceased. This next fact blew my mind, and I'm still a little bit in disbelief over it. Professional mourners were a thing. Now, people would hire these professional mourners to come and walk in their processions and look the appropriate amount of somber. They were also called mutes. Now, I don't know if this was such a common practice that people were open about it, like, yeah, I hired these people to come walk in my brother's funeral, or if it was more of like a swept under the rug thing, like, oh, those people, who are they? Oh, they're my cousins, yeah. They're from like another country. I wouldn't talk to them, I don't even know if they speak English, but they're also like super torn up over Joseph's death, and they're just the poor things. I'd just leave them alone if I were you, please. If you're into the macabre and don't know about Victorian mourning, then welcome to your wonderland. It's been waiting for you. Post-mortem photos were a thing. And they became a thing because sometimes people didn't really have time to get a portrait of them and the one that they loved before they died. Whether this was a painting portrait or a photo, which were still fairly new at the time. So this became post-mortem photos. I've seen one in particular of a father and his baby, and it's haunting and sad and morbid. And this wasn't just done with babies. Typically, the person would be, makeup would be applied to make them seem livelier, and the person could be posed as though they were alive to look like they were alive in the photo, or posed to look as though they were just asleep. Which both are creepy, but posed to look alive is creepier. Let's just get that out there. There was also hair art, which is very interesting to me. I feel like people are kind of disgusted by loose hair, and they'll see hair and they're like, ew, but I don't understand why. Because I used to do it too. Like, I would find a hair on my desk in high school and I'd be like, ew, whose is that? But at the end of the day, it's just hair, right? So I don't get it. But hair art was a thing. Hair jewelry was a very big thing. Typically, lockets were worn with hair of the deceased would be braided and put in the locket. But I've also seen bracelets and rings where it's just braided and put together with the clasp. Or the ring that I saw almost didn't even look like hair anymore. I think the person might have been like a ginger. So it was like, it looked kind of like copper, like really thin copper strings braided together. And it was so tight that it was so old and tight, and it didn't even look like hair, and it was very confusing, but it was hair. I've also seen some very pretty hair art. There was something I saw in the museum that I worked at that the hair from multiple siblings was taken and braided together in like this flower design and placed inside a shadow box. It's actually really pretty. I don't think I have a photo, but if I do, I'll put it here. But I probably don't have a photo of it. There was also death masks, which was a cast of someone's face taken after they had died. In the museum I worked at, we had one of an Irish man. We don't know who he was. We just know that he was Irish. And it's so interesting because they're so detailed. Like, you can see their pores and like the outline of their eyelashes. And even some hairs were stuck in there. Like, there was a few eyebrow hairs and I think a beard or a mustache hair stuck in it. And if I stared at him long enough, it felt like it was gonna open his eyes because it was that detailed. And it's really interesting how they did that and why, but it's cool. Life masks were also a thing, but I think those were more reserved for people of prominence. Like, we had an Abraham Lincoln life mask, which actually included his beard, which was interesting and very heavy. Another person that had a death mask done was Marie Antoinette. Madame Tussauds, you might know the wax figure franchise, was actually a real person. And she was commissioned after Marie Antoinette was decapitated to make a death mask of her face, which is why you may know that her head and body were separated for some time. They're together now, but it was because her body was buried while her head was taken away to Madame Tussauds. This last fact isn't a way of remembering the dead, but it's bleak, and I just felt like it fit better in this part of the video. Body watching. I don't think that's the actual term for it, but it's my term for it. When someone died, their body would just be laid out on a table in their home until their funeral. And at that time, when it was in the home, it had to be watched at all times until it went into the ground. And this means children too. Like, children were not spared from seeing the dead bodies. In fact, children in poorer homes would sometimes still have to share a room or even a bed with a dying sibling. Seems healthy, mentally and physically. Mourning rituals became less particular and socially enforced moving into the Edwardian era, especially after World War I, where there was so much loss that the rigidity of mourning etiquette just didn't make anyone feel better anymore. And now, today, mourning rituals are practically non-existent. Like, even we've loosened on the wearing of black to a funeral based on the wishes of the departed. And like I said earlier, they're becoming more of a celebration of life than they are about death. So it's interesting to see how things change over time. To wrap this video up, I just want to say that this is my first time wearing historical clothing and I have loved it. When I first started this channel, I had an idea to make videos in historical clothing, but I didn't have any and they're very expensive, so it's not something that you just go out and buy. So I wasn't sure if that would ever happen, but then my very kind friend let me borrow this, and as soon as I got it into my possession, even temporarily, I was like, I am taking full advantage of this. So that's why this video is a little last minute, because I didn't know that I was going to be borrowing this dress. So hopefully this video isn't as messy as I think it is, but if it is, I'm sorry. I did my best. And that's the tea on history. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and to subscribe if you want to see more, and to click the little bell below if you want to be notified when I upload new videos. As always, I will be linking all of my social medias below and all of my sources. Now again, I hope this video wasn't too messy and that you enjoyed it, and I hope I get to do something like this with historical clothing again. Let me know if that's something that you guys would be interested in. Because, you know, the loss of a husband is just more devastating. There's a truck outside. I'm trying to be sarcastic. God bless America. And equal lengths for men and women.